I've been writing books since 1963, or at least publishing since 1963. My first book was about Lawrence of Arabia. The result is that I've dealt with war, or the aftermath of war, for many, many decades now. I was fascinated by war because I collected bubblegum cards. There were war cards in the 1930s dealing with the war in Spain, the war in China, the war between Japan and the war in Ethiopia. And these were bubblegum cards for a penny each. I threw away the bubblegum, kept the cards, and that taught me my first history of the war. These were like posters, that is the portraits and pictures they drew. I got first involved with biography, with people, because events are steered by people. The events occur whether the people were involved with them or not to start. But people make war, and people continue the war, and people end war. And one thing I learned very quickly was that peace is harder to make than war. When I landed in Korea, there were two smells that just obliterated everything else. One was the smell of the decay of the dead, and the other was the fact that the farmers used fecal fertilizer, human fertilizer, and there were what were called honey carts all over the place carrying the fecal fertilizer. So those two aromas were war to me. Yeah. Not the idea of I wish they'd come again and excite me, but the devastation and the stink of war. Well, I was involved with the prisoner of war command in the 8th Army. The prisoners mutinied. We had well over 100,000 prisoners, and they were basically in two camps, on the mainland and on the island of Koji. I had nothing to do with the island of Koji, where there were something like 80,000 prisoners. They rioted. The 187th Airborne Regiment had to be called in to put down the riots. People died. The prisoners used makeshift weapons like Molotov cocktails and lances that they made out of the ends of stretchers. They did the same thing on the mainland in a smaller capacity. And I wrote a book called War in the Wards about the mutiny in the prisoner of war hospital. It was the biggest hospital in the world. It had over 10,000 POW patients, and more than that number of POW laborers who serviced the prisoner patients. Even the amputees went to war. The horror of war, I guess, can't be explained in that respect because no pictures were taken, no pictures were allowed, no correspondence were there. But one compound of 3,000 amputees marched in mutiny with makeshift weapons, marched on pegs, marched on stumps. It's an incredible bit of fanaticism that sustained them. And they had to be shot down. I remember one prisoner who was one-legged marching and being hit by a concussion grenade that landed at his foot, rather, he had only one. When the grenade exploded, he had no feet. But this is the kind of horror you find in war.
You actually had to write up your own request for a medal.
Well,
how'd that work?
I had to do that because I was involved in a secret intelligence operation that was contrary to the Geneva Convention, contrary to all military uses, or usages, I should say. But war isn't fought by gentlemen. The gentlemen who are the senior generals may sit back in posh circumstances and direct you, but the real war is carried on otherwise. Our job, secretly, was to turn prisoners. That is, we tried to find sympathetic prisoners on the front lines who claimed, when they were taken prisoner, that they were forced into the service. They were really anti-communist. They had nothing to do with the government that forced them to invade South Korea, etc. And so the ones that seemed most believable, we trained in the South to go back and become spies. They went back by submarine and dinghy, or they went back by parachute, and almost nothing of this has ever been described in history books. And my own colonel didn't know that I was involved in this, because this was a compartmentalized operation that you only knew what you were supposed to know, and nothing more. The result was that when I was about to leave Korea after 17 months there, he called me in and said, I have a TWX, that is a teletype message, ordering me, he meant himself, ordering me to write you up for a medal, a Bronze Star medal. But I don't know what for. He said, you're a professor, write me something. And I wasn't a professor, although I had taught as a graduate student. And he gave me a pad and pencil, and I had to write something innocuous that didn't indicate anything that I was really doing. And I thought it was very silly, but I wrote something about ground action against the enemy with no details whatever, and gave it back to him, and he said, fine, that will do. And I got up and saluted and left. And on a troop ship, I went home, and that was it. About 6 months later, I got a letter telling me that I had been awarded a medal. Would I like to come to Fort Meade, Maryland, and receive the medal in a ceremony? Or would I just like it mailed? I said, mail it. And there was no ceremony. I didn't want to go back to Fort Meade, Maryland for anything at all. And the next day or day after, I got another letter from the Department of Defense saying I had been approved for top secret clearance. That is, the work I had been doing in the Army was finally approved when I was a civilian. This was called Operation Turncoat. Turncoat meant, quite literally, turning prisoners into your side. When they were offered the opportunity, if you can call it that, to go back and spy for us, they were told that if they got back safely, if they were Chinese and they got back safely, we would send them to Taiwan, and they would be safe in Taiwan. If they were North Korean or South Korean and pressed into the North Korean army, we would take care of them in South Korea somehow and give them some kind of bonus. I don't have the details to that because that was not part of my job. That is the inducement part afterwards. Nor was the information that they were supposed to pick up part of my job. My job was to recruit them and make sure that they were our kind of people. It didn't work that way. Some of them, I think probably most of them, took advantage of our being so naive at war by using this as a ticket to go home. That was very easy. We were taking them back home and training them to go back home. Some of them must have done their job because we listened to Moscow radio. Very often, Moscow radio told us how many of our planes were shot down that we didn't know about because our side never revealed the facts. But we also learned that the other side captured some spies and had executed them summarily. And there were no details were given except on occasion they said that spies had shot some of their officers and then were caught and were executed on the spot. And we figured they were our people, but we never knew. This is what happens in compartmentalized circumstances, where you're only given a little bit of information for your own use and for the use of the intelligence people, and you're not told anything else. I would have an officer, he claimed to be an officer, he claimed to be a major, he gave me a name. I'm not sure the name meant anything, it was not that it was real. He said, we have some potential spies that are prisoners of war in the prisoner of war hospital. We want to get them loose so we can train them to go spy in China and North Korea. We want you to get them loose. So that was another part of the job. I killed prisoners on paper. That is, they were considered dead and they were spirited out to be spies. Some of them were escapers. That is, I announced that they had escaped and couldn't be found, and they were trained as spies. Some of them were taken out on stretchers for major surgery. And yes, we took them out on stretchers, but they disappeared. They disappeared because they were part of Operation Turncoat. You don't find this in the history books. A lot of history just doesn't turn up. So you have it there.
This is fascinating. So there's really no way to gauge the efficacy of the program itself, is there?
I would gauge it as a total failure. As I said, it's compartmentalized. I have no way of knowing the parts that were not involved in my doing. But it seems to me that many of them took this as a cheap way to get a ticket home. And they pretended to be on our side, but they went home. I don't know of any actual information that they contributed, because that was not part of my deal.
As you sit here today in 2014, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic?
I think there never will be an end to war. I'm hoping all the wars will be small wars that can be contained. But I don't see how you can win a war today, because even if you win it, you lose it. How can you win a war with an atomic bomb that is going to pollute the atmosphere? And how can you win a war against fanatics who will not end a war because it's not going their way?
Well, thank you once
Yeah.
again. This has been terrific.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.